I thought I was just another face in the crowd at the most expensive wedding San Diego had ever seen, but when the bride locked eyes with me through her tears and whispered, "Help me," everything I believed about my past shattered in an instant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would expose a 20-year-old secret that powerful people had spent millions to keep buried, and prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most ordinary places. Mark Rodriguez had been pushing his janitor's cart through the halls of Riverside Elementary School for 3 years, and he'd learned to appreciate the quiet dignity of work that most people never noticed. At 32, his weathered hands told the story of a man who'd raised his 6-year-old daughter Emma alone since she was barely walking, working double shifts to keep their small apartment and put food on their table. The other staff members knew him as reliable and kind, always the first to volunteer when someone needed help, though he rarely spoke about his personal life or the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was looking. Emma Rodriguez possessed the sharp intuition that children develop when they learn early to read the unspoken emotions of the adults around them. She spent her afternoons in the school's aftercare program while her father finished his evening cleaning rounds, and had developed an unusual fascination with the wealthy families who occasionally visited for fundraising events. Her teacher had noticed that Emma drew the same mysterious woman repeatedly in her artwork, always wearing elegant dresses and looking sad, though when asked about these drawings, Emma would simply say she dreamed about a pretty lady who seemed lost and needed to find her way home. That Thursday afternoon in late September, Emma burst into the supply closet where Mark was organizing cleaning materials, her small face flushed with excitement and something that looked remarkably like recognition. She clutched a crumpled newspaper in her hands, the Society section, featuring a full-color photograph of San Diego's upcoming wedding of the year between tech heiress Jessica Blackwood and real estate mogul Richard Sterling. The ceremony was scheduled for that weekend at the exclusive Grand Ocean View Resort, with guest lists that read like a directory of California's most influential families. Mark glanced at the newspaper absently, expecting to see another story about people whose lives existed in a completely different universe from his own world of mop buckets and late-night shifts. Instead, he found himself staring at a face that stopped his breath completely, a woman whose features carried an impossible familiarity that sent his mind racing back through decades of deliberately buried memories. The bride's dark eyes held the same distinctive shape he saw in his mirror every morning, the same stubborn set to her jaw that Emma had inherited, the same small scar above the left eyebrow that Mark had carried since childhood. Jessica Blackwood, according to the newspaper's glowing coverage, was the adopted daughter of technology empire builder Victoria Blackwood, raised in luxury and educated at the finest private schools, preparing to marry into even greater wealth and social prominence. But Mark remembered a different name, a different life, and a little girl who had been torn away from him when social services decided that a 17-year-old boy couldn't possibly care for his 8-year-old sister after their parents died in a car accident that changed everything. The newspaper trembled in his hands as 20 years of wondering, searching, and grieving crashed over him like a wave. Emma studied his face with the intense concentration she usually reserved for solving difficult math problems, then pointed to the photograph with absolute certainty. "That's the lady from my dreams," she announced, with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when stating obvious truths that adults somehow miss. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She's been trying to tell me something important, and I think she needs our help. Mark's hands shook as he stared at the newspaper photograph, memories flooding back with devastating clarity. Jessica Maria Rodriguez had been 8 years old when the state decided he was too young and too poor to be her guardian. He remembered her tear-streaked face pressed against the back window of the social worker's car as they drove her away to what officials promised would be a quote-unquote better opportunity with a family who could provide stability and education that a teenage boy working minimum-wage jobs could never offer. He had tried everything to get her back during those first desperate months, sleeping in his beat-up Honda outside the county offices waiting for caseworkers who never had time to see him, working 3 jobs while studying for his GED, believing that if he could just prove he was responsible enough, mature enough, successful enough, they would bring Jessica home. But the system had already decided their fate. and 17-year-old boys from broken families didn't win custody battles against prosperous couples with perfect credit scores and recommendation letters from judges and senators. The last time he had seen his sister was during a supervised visit at a sterile government building 6 months after she was taken. Jessica had whispered promises that she would never forget him, that she would find him when she grew up, that nothing could change the fact that they were family. But as the months turned into years and his letters were returned unopened, Mark began to understand that Jessica's new family had resources and influence that could erase inconvenient histories completely. By the time she turned 18 and legally free to make her own choices, Jessica Rodriguez had apparently ceased to exist, replaced entirely by Jessica Blackwood. Emma studied the newspaper with the focused intensity of a detective examining crucial evidence. She had never heard the complete story of her father's childhood, only fragments that emerged during his rare unguarded moments when grief made him forget that some truths were too heavy for 6-year-old shoulders. But she possessed the intuitive understanding that comes from growing up with a parent who carries unhealed wounds, and she had learned to recognize the particular quality of sadness that appeared in her father's eyes whenever he thought she wasn't watching. The elementary school had become Mark's refuge after Emma started kindergarten there, a place where his work had meaning beyond simple survival, and where his daughter could remain close while he earned their living. Principal Martinez had hired him despite his lack of formal education, recognizing something in his quiet determination that couldn't be measured by traditional qualifications. The job provided health insurance for Emma and allowed him to be present for the small daily moments that single parents learn to treasure, even if it meant working until midnight to finish his cleaning rounds after spending the afternoon helping with her homework. His co-workers knew him as a man who listened more than he spoke, and who possessed an uncanny ability to fix things that seemed beyond repair. Broken playground equipment, temperamental heating systems, and even the occasional personal crisis among the teaching staff somehow resolved themselves when Mark quietly applied his careful attention and patient persistence. But none of them suspected that he spent his evenings searching the internet for traces of Jessica Rodriguez, following dead-end leads and social media profiles that never quite matched the sister he remembered. The Blackwood family name carried significant weight in San Diego's social and business circles, representing old money transformed into new technology fortunes through strategic investments and ruthless business practices. Victoria Blackwood had built her empire by identifying opportunities that others missed and eliminating obstacles that others considered insurmountable. Her adoption of Jessica 20 years earlier had been presented to society as an act of charitable generosity, rescuing an orphan child from the failures of the foster care system, and providing her with advantages that her original circumstances could never have offered. Jessica's transformation from Rodriguez to Blackwood had been methodical and complete. Private tutors replaced public school education. Designer clothing replaced thrift store finds. Elocution lessons eliminated any trace of the accent she had shared with her brother. By the time she entered high school, Jessica spoke French fluently, rode horses competitively, and could navigate charity galas with the same confidence that her 8-year-old self had once shown while stealing bread from corner stores to feed her hungry teenage brother. But Victoria Blackwood understood that true reinvention required more than surface changes. Jessica's original birth certificate had been sealed through legal maneuvers that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Her school records from before the adoption simply disappeared from official databases. Even the social workers who had handled her case found new careers in distant cities, their silence purchased through generous consulting contracts and thinly veiled threats about professional consequences for those who discussed confidential cases with unauthorized parties. The engagement to Richard Sterling represented the culmination of Victoria's 20-year investment in Jessica's transformation. Sterling Enterprises controlled vast holdings in commercial real estate throughout Southern California, and a marriage between the families would create a business dynasty capable of reshaping entire neighborhoods according to their vision. Richard himself was handsome in the calculated way that comes from expensive personal trainers and cosmetic dentistry, educated at the right schools, connected to the right people, and completely convinced that his wealth entitled him to whatever he desired most. Jessica had learned to play her role perfectly over the years, attending the right parties, supporting the right charusas, and dating the approved men who moved through Victoria's social circles like pieces on an elaborate chessboard. She excelled at presenting the image of grateful contentment that her adoptive mother required, never mentioning the dreams that haunted her sleep or the persistent feeling that crucial pieces of her identity remained missing. The nightmares always featured the same scene: a teenage boy reaching desperately through the back window of a moving car while she screamed his name and promised to remember him forever. The wedding preparations had consumed the past 6 months of Jessica's life, orchestrated by Victoria with the precision of a military campaign. Every detail, from the imported flowers to the guest seating arrangements, served multiple purposes, cementing business relationships while demonstrating the Blackwood family's continued ascendance in California's hierarchy of wealth and influence. The ceremony itself would be broadcast live on the society pages of 3 major newspapers, establishing Jessica and Richard as the new generation of power couples whose decisions would shape the region's economic future. Mark folded the newspaper carefully, his decision crystallizing with the same quiet determination that had carried him through 20 years of wondering whether his sister was alive, safe, or happy. Emma watched his face transform from shock to resolve, recognizing the expression he wore when fixing something that everyone else had given up on. She reached for his hand with the trust that children show when they sense that adults are about to do something both necessary and dangerous. The Grand Ocean View Resort was less than an hour's drive from Riverside Elementary, but it might as well have existed on another planet for people like Mark and Emma Rodriguez. The exclusive venue required security clearances for vendors and background checks for staff, surrounded by gates and guards, designed to ensure that only the appropriate class of people could witness the union of 2 of California's most prominent families. But Mark had learned during his years of invisible work that determined people could find ways into places that seemed impenetrable, especially when they understood that the most important battles were fought by those whom society preferred to ignore completely. Mark spent the next 48 hours developing a plan that bordered on the impossible. Getting inside the Grand Ocean View Resort during the most exclusive wedding of the year would require more than determination. It demanded the kind of careful observation and strategic thinking that he had learned during his years of navigating systems designed to keep people like him invisible. He contacted David Santos, his roommate and closest friend who worked for a catering company that occasionally handled high-end events, hoping that connections in the service industry might provide the opening he desperately needed. David had served as Mark's unofficial family for the past 3 years, stepping into the role of uncle to Emma and brother to Mark with the easy generosity of someone who understood that real families were created through choice rather than blood. A former Marine who had returned from overseas deployment to find that civilian life required different kinds of courage, David possessed the practical skills and unshakable loyalty that made seemingly impossible missions feel merely difficult. When Mark explained the situation, David's response was immediate and unwavering. No questions about legality or consequences, just the simple statement that family was worth any risk. The catering company's records showed that Sterling Enterprises had hired additional temporary staff for the wedding weekend, including servers who would need to pass basic background checks, but wouldn't receive the intensive security screening reserved for permanent employees. David's supervisor owed him several favors, from covering shifts during family emergencies, and a few strategic conversations resulted in Mark being added to the weekend crew list as a temporary bartender, complete with the uniform and identification badge that would get him through the resort's outer security perimeter. Emma insisted on being part of the plan, despite Mark's attempts to arrange alternative childcare for the weekend. She possessed an intuitive understanding that this mission involved more than simply attending a wedding, and her 6-year-old logic concluded that the lady from her dreams had been trying to communicate with her specifically for important reasons that adults might miss. Her artistic talents had evolved beyond simple drawings into detailed sketches that captured emotional nuances with startling accuracy, and she had spent the past 2 days creating what she called a memory book, filled with images of the brother and sister she had never met but somehow recognized. The Grand Ocean View Resort sprawled across 50 acres of clifftop property overlooking the Pacific Ocean, its Mediterranean architecture and manicured gardens designed to create an atmosphere of timeless elegance that justified the astronomical fees charged for exclusive access. Security teams had been coordinating for weeks to ensure that the wedding proceeded without disruption from uninvited guests, paparazzi, or protesters who might object to the conspicuous display of wealth during a period of economic uncertainty throughout the region. Mark arrived at the service entrance at dawn on Saturday morning, wearing the black vest and white shirt that transformed him into another invisible member of the army of workers who made luxury events possible. His hands trembled slightly as he pinned the temporary employee badge to his uniform, knowing that discovery would result in arrest, prosecution, and probably permanent separation from Emma. But the photograph of Jessica in her wedding dress, published in that morning's newspaper with a caption describing her as radiant with joy, showed eyes that Mark recognized as carrying the same haunted quality that had followed him through 20 years of unanswered questions. The resort's kitchen operated with military precision during major events, directed by executive chefs who commanded their staff with the absolute authority of generals coordinating complex battlefield maneuvers. Mark was assigned to one of 6 portable bars scattered throughout the reception area, a position that would provide him with mobility and access to the main gathering spaces where Jessica would be greeting guests and posing for the photographers who would document every moment of her transformation into Mrs. Richard Sterling. Jessica Blackwood stood in the bridal suite surrounded by an army of stylists, photographers, and attendants who fussed over every detail of her appearance with the intensity of people whose professional reputations depended on creating perfection. The wedding dress had been custom, designed by a European couturier, its intricate beadwork and flowing silk train representing months of craftsmanship, and a price tag that exceeded the annual salary of most working families. But beneath the layers of expensive fabric and professional makeup, Jessica felt the familiar sensation of being trapped inside someone else's life, playing a role that grew more suffocating with each passing hour. The dreams had intensified during the weeks leading up to the wedding, featuring increasingly vivid scenes of a teenage boy whose face she couldn't quite remember, but whose voice called her name with desperate urgency. Victoria had dismissed these nocturnal disturbances as pre-wedding anxiety, recommending meditation and prescription sleep aids to ensure that nothing interfered with Jessica's performance on the most important day of her carefully orchestrated life. But the dreams persisted, accompanied by a growing sense that she was about to make an irreversible mistake that would close the door forever on parts of herself that she had never been allowed to explore. Richard Sterling arrived at the resort in a convoy of luxury vehicles that announced his importance to anyone who might have missed the extensive media coverage of his business achievements and social connections. He moved through the pre-ceremony preparations with the confident ease of someone who had never doubted his right to claim whatever he desired, treating the wedding as another successful acquisition that would enhance his portfolio of valuable assets. His interactions with Jessica were polite and appropriately affectionate for the cameras, but carried the detached quality of a business partnership rather than a romantic union. Victoria Blackwood orchestrated the final preparations with the focused intensity that had built her empire, checking and rechecking every detail that could possibly affect the flawless execution of an event that represented the culmination of her 20-year investment in Jessica's transformation. The guest list read like a directory of California's most influential families, business leaders who controlled billions in assets and political figures whose decisions shaped policy throughout the region. This wedding was more than a social celebration, it was a strategic merger that would solidify the Blackwood family's position at the apex of West Coast power structures. Mark positioned himself behind the bar closest to the ceremony site, his hands mechanically polishing glassware while his eyes searched the gathering crowd for the first glimpse of his sister in 20 years. The guests arrived in waves of expensive automobiles, their designer clothing and jewelry representing more wealth than Mark had seen in his entire lifetime. But their conversations revealed the same petty concerns and insecurities that affected people at every economic level, just wrapped in more expensive packaging and delivered with accents cultivated through private education. Emma had convinced David to bring her to the resort's public beach area, which provided a distant view of the ceremony site through the ornamental fencing that separated the exclusive event space from areas accessible to ordinary families. She carried her memory book and a small pair of binoculars that David had borrowed from his hiking equipment, determined to witness whatever was about to unfold between her father and the mysterious lady who had been visiting her dreams with increasing frequency. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at sunset, a timing calculated to provide optimal lighting for the professional photographers and videographers, who would preserve every moment for posterity and future business networking opportunities. Mark watched the wedding party assemble on the clifftop terrace, their movements choreographed with the precision of a ballet performance designed to project images of happiness and success to an audience that included representatives from major media outlets and business publications. When Jessica finally appeared at the end of the white carpet that stretched across the manicured lawn, Mark felt his breath catch in his throat. 20 years had transformed the Masco Lumbia, frightened 8-year-old girl he remembered into a stunning woman. but her eyes still carried the same intelligence and stubborn determination that had helped them survive their parents' death and the chaotic months that followed. She moved with practiced grace toward the altar where Richard Sterling waited, with the satisfied expression of someone claiming a prize that enhanced his status among his peers. But as Jessica walked down the aisle, her gaze swept across the assembled crowd and came to rest on Mark's face with a shock of recognition that stopped her progress completely. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, brother and sister stared at each other across 20 years of forced separation, and Mark saw in her eyes the same desperate hope and terrified vulnerability that he felt rising in his own chest. The wedding guests stirred with confusion as Jessica stood frozen halfway to the altar, her bouquet trembling in hands that suddenly remembered reaching through a car window toward a teenage boy who had promised never to stop looking for her. The wedding guests began murmuring among themselves as Jessica remained motionless on the carpet, her face pale beneath the professional makeup that suddenly seemed like an elaborate mask hiding her true identity. Richard Sterling stepped forward from the altar, his expression shifting from confident anticipation to irritated confusion as he realized that his bride was experiencing some kind of breakdown in front of California's most influential business leaders, and 3 television crews broadcasting the ceremony live to society pages across the region. Victoria Blackwood moved with swift efficiency from her position in the front row, her designer heels clicking against the stone pathway as she approached Jessica with the kind of controlled urgency that she typically reserved for corporate crises requiring immediate damage control. Her whispered words were inaudible to the wedding guests, but Mark could see from Jessica's body language that her adoptive mother was delivering firm instructions about maintaining composure and fulfilling obligations that had cost the family considerable time and money to arrange. Mark abandoned his position behind the bar and began moving through the crowd of confused guests, his server's uniform providing temporary camouflage as he navigated between clusters of wealthy families, trying to understand why the ceremony had suddenly stalled. Security personnel were beginning to take notice of the disruption, their trained eyes scanning the gathering for potential threats or unauthorized individuals who might be responsible for the bride's unexpected behavior. Jessica's gaze never left Mark's face as he approached the ceremony area, and something in her expression shifted from shocked recognition to desperate hope. She took a single step backward, away from Richard and Victoria, her movement creating ripples of concerned conversation among the guests, who had paid substantial amounts to witness what was supposed to be the social event of the season. The wedding photographer continued capturing images with professional persistence, perhaps sensing that whatever was unfolding would become more historically significant than routine ceremonial documentation. When Mark reached the edge of the white carpet that separated the wedding party from the assembled crowd, Jessica's voice cut through the murmurs of confusion with crystal clarity. "Miguel," she said, using the childhood nickname that no one had spoken aloud in 20 years. The single word carried enough emotion to silence 300 guests and create a moment of perfect stillness that seemed to suspend time itself around the clifftop ceremony site. Victoria Blackwood's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly as she realized that Jessica was addressing the server who had somehow gained access to the most exclusive event of the year. Her eyes narrowed with the calculating intelligence that had built her business empire, immediately recognizing that this disruption represented more than simple wedding day nerves or a random security breach. The young man standing at the edge of her daughter's ceremony carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed familiar in ways that made Victoria's chest tighten with dread. Richard Sterling's reaction was more direct and considerably less subtle than his future mother-in-law's strategic assessment of the situation. He strode down the carpet toward Mark with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to removing obstacles through sheer force of personality and financial intimidation. His voice carried clearly across the ceremony site as he demanded explanations for the disruption and threatened to have security remove anyone who didn't belong at a private family celebration. Mark stood his ground as Richard approached, his years of invisible work having taught him that authority figures often revealed their true character when challenged by people they considered beneath their notice. He met Richard's angry glare with calm steadiness, speaking directly to Jessica rather than acknowledging the man who claimed ownership of her future. "Jess, do you remember the promise you made, the last time we saw each other?" The question hit Jessica with the force of a physical blow, unlocking memories that 20 years of careful reprogramming had failed to completely erase. She remembered the sterile government building where supervised visits took place, the institutional smell of disinfectant and fear, and the 8-year-old's desperate vow to never forget her brother, no matter how many people tried to convince her that forgetting would be easier and healthier for everyone involved. Security personnel were moving through the crowd now, their communication devices crackling with coded instructions as they attempted to assess whether the situation required discreet intervention or more dramatic measures. The wedding guests found themselves witnesses to a confrontation that clearly involved years of buried history and emotions that had no place in the carefully orchestrated celebration they had expected to attend. Emma watched from her position near the beach fence, her small hands gripping the binoculars as she focused on the scene unfolding above the resort's manicured grounds. Even at a distance, she could sense the electric tension radiating from the wedding party, and recognized her father's protective posture as he faced down people whose wealth and social position typically intimidated working-class individuals into submission. Victoria Blackwood stepped between Jessica and Mark with the authoritative presence that had intimidated corporate rivals and government regulators throughout her career. Her voice carried the icy precision that she used during hostile business negotiations, informing Mark that he was trespassing on private property and would face serious legal consequences if he didn't remove himself immediately from an event where he clearly didn't belong. But Jessica moved around her adoptive mother with surprising quickness, closing the distance between herself and Mark until they stood face to face for the first time since she was 8 years old. The wedding dress that had cost more than most people's annual income suddenly seemed like an elaborate costume that she was wearing for someone else's benefit, completely disconnected from the person she actually was beneath the layers of expensive fabric and social expectations. "I never stopped looking for you," Mark said quietly, his words meant only for Jessica but audible to the guests closest to the developing confrontation. "Every day for 20 years. I wondered if you were safe, if you were happy, if you remembered that you had a brother who loved you more than anything in the world." The tears that began flowing down Jessica's face destroyed hours of professional makeup artistry, but revealed an emotional authenticity that had been missing from every aspect of the carefully planned ceremony. She reached toward Mark with trembling hands, then stopped herself as the full weight of her impossible situation crashed over her like a wave. Choosing her brother meant abandoning the only life she had known for 2 decades, disappointing the woman who had rescued her from foster care, and walking away from a marriage that represented security and social acceptance. Richard Sterling's patience finally snapped completely as he realized that his bride was seriously considering abandoning their wedding for a reunion with a janitor whose very presence threatened everything that the Sterling and Blackwood families had worked to achieve through their strategic alliance. He grabbed Jessica's arm with enough force to leave marks beneath the delicate fabric of her dress, his voice rising to a volume that carried across the entire ceremony site as he demanded that she remember her obligations and stop embarrassing both families in front of their most important business associates. The physical contact seemed to snap Jessica out of her emotional paralysis and into a clarity that surprised everyone present, including herself. She jerked away from Richard's grip with enough force to tear the expensive fabric of her dress, her voice carrying across the clifftop with absolute certainty as she addressed the assembled crowd of confused wedding guests. "This marriage is over before it begins," she announced, her words creating a shocked silence that stretched across the entire resort property. "I'm Jessica Rodriguez, not Jessica Blackwood, and this man is my brother Miguel Rodriguez, who has been stolen from my life for 20 years by people who thought money could rewrite history and love could be purchased like a business transaction." The revelation created chaos among the wedding guests as reporters scrambled to document the dramatic collapse of what was supposed to be a routine society wedding. Security personnel found themselves caught between competing authorities as Victoria Blackwood demanded Mark's immediate arrest, while Jessica insisted that he was family and belonged wherever she chose to include him. Mark extended his hand toward his sister, palm up in a gesture of invitation rather than demand. The choice had to be hers, made freely without coercion from anyone who claimed to know what was best for her future. Jessica stared at his calloused palm for a moment that seemed to contain their entire shared history, then placed her hand in his with the same trust she had shown when they were children, navigating a world that had become dangerous and unpredictable after their parents' death. Mark led Jessica away from the chaos of the collapsed ceremony, her torn wedding dress trailing behind them as they walked hand in hand down the stone pathway toward the resort's exit. The assembled guests watched in stunned silence as the bride abandoned everything she had been given for everything she had lost, choosing a janitor brother over a billionaire husband without a moment's hesitation once the truth was finally spoken aloud. Victoria Blackwood's attempts to regain control of the situation crumbled as reporters began asking pointed questions about Jessica's original identity and the circumstances surrounding her adoption 20 years earlier. The careful narrative about rescuing an orphan child from poverty was falling apart under scrutiny that revealed deliberate efforts to erase Jessica's family connections and legal maneuvers that had prevented her brother from maintaining contact. Richard Sterling found himself abandoned at the altar in front of California's most influential families. His humiliation broadcast lived to thousands of viewers who would remember this moment long after they forgot his business achievements or social connections. The merger between Sterling Enterprises and Blackwood Industries that had been contingent on the marriage dissolved instantly, leaving both families to face the financial and social consequences of their calculated cruelty. Emma ran toward them from the beach area, her memory book clutched against her chest as she finally met the mysterious lady from her dreams who was now revealed to be her Aunt Jessica. The reunion between the three family members took place on the resort's public grounds, away from the wealth and privilege that had separated them for so long, surrounded by ordinary families enjoying weekend beach outings who had no idea they were witnessing the conclusion of a 20-year search for stolen love. David Santos appeared with his catering truck, having monitored the situation through Emma's excited phone calls, and positioned himself for a quick escape if law enforcement arrived to arrest Mark for trespassing or disrupting the peace. The four of them drove away from the Grand Ocean View Resort in a vehicle that smelled like industrial kitchen equipment and restaurant supplies, but carried them toward a freedom that no amount of money could purchase. Jessica spent the next several hours in Mark's modest apartment, surrounded by the evidence of his simple but genuine life, while she processed the reality of everything she had abandoned and everything she had reclaimed. The expensive wedding dress seemed absurd in the small living room decorated with Emma's artwork and furniture from secondhand stores, but Jessica felt more authentically herself in those cramped quarters than she had in the Blackwood Mansion's palatial rooms. The legal battles that followed lasted 18 months and attracted national media attention as Jessica fought to reclaim her original identity and Mark defended his right to maintain contact with the sister who had been systematically stolen from his life. Victoria Blackwood deployed armies of expensive attorneys and private investigators, but found that public opinion had shifted decisively against wealthy families who purchased children and then erased their histories for social convenience. Emma became an unofficial celebrity among her elementary school classmates, famous for having an aunt who had escaped from a billionaire wedding to reunite with her real family. Her teacher noticed that the mysterious lady no longer appeared in Emma's artwork, replaced by drawings of complete families doing ordinary activities like grocery shopping and playing in parks, activities that carried profound meaning for people who had learned not to take love for granted. Mark returned to his job at Riverside Elementary School but found that his colleagues viewed him differently after learning about his successful mission to rescue his sister from a marriage that would have completed her transformation into someone else entirely. Principal Martinez offered him opportunities for advancement that recognized his intelligence and dedication, finally seeing past the janitor's uniform to the man who had never stopped fighting for his family. Jessica enrolled in community college courses while working part-time at a nonprofit organization that helped families navigate the foster care system, using her insider knowledge of wealth and privilege to advocate for children whose stories might otherwise be erased by people with enough money to rewrite inconvenient histories. The skills she had learned during her years as Jessica Blackwood proved valuable when applied to protecting vulnerable families rather than enhancing corporate profits. The annual community center fundraiser where Jessica told her story for the first time drew an audience that included former wedding guests who had witnessed her dramatic choice at the Grand Ocean View Resort. She spoke without notes or prepared remarks, simply sharing the truth about what happened when money and social position convinced people that love was a commodity that could be purchased, and family connections were obstacles that could be eliminated through legal maneuvering. Mark sat in the front row with Emma on his lap, both of them surrounded by the extended family of friends and neighbors who had supported them through the difficult months when Jessica's decision to reclaim her identity created legal and financial complications that threatened to separate them again. The applause that followed Jessica's speech lasted several minutes, recognizing not just her courage in abandoning wealth and privilege, but her wisdom in choosing authentic relationships over artificial security. The final photograph that appeared in the newspapers showed 3 generations of the Rodriguez family at Emma's elementary school graduation ceremony. Mark wore his best thrift store suit while Jessica appeared in a simple dress purchased at a discount retailer, both of them glowing with pride as Emma received recognition for academic achievement and artistic excellence that had flourished once her family was finally complete. Victoria Blackwood's business empire survived the scandal, but never recovered the social standing that had been built on carefully constructed lies about charitable generosity and family values. She spent her remaining years surrounded by the wealth and influence that she had prioritized over authentic human connections, learning too late that some choices cannot be undone through strategic planning or financial manipulation. The small apartment where Mark and Emma had lived for years was eventually replaced by a modest house, with enough space for Jessica to establish permanent residence, and Emma to have her own room decorated with artwork, celebrating families who chose love over convenience. The mortgage payments were manageable on 2 working-class incomes combined with Jessica's inheritance from her biological parents' life insurance policies that Victoria had been required to release during the legal proceedings. Emma's bedroom walls displayed photographs and drawings documenting the complete Rodriguez family history, including images of the grandparents she had never met, but whose love had created the foundation for everything that followed. Her favorite picture showed Mark at 17 holding 8-year-old Jessica's hand outside the courthouse where they had been separated, both of them unaware that their story would eventually become proof that authentic love could survive any obstacle when people refused to accept that some separations were permanent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.